Excellent then. Good morning and welcome. We're live for this e-Memoir session in association with NCFE. This morning we'll be looking at supporting the employer through the gateway process. We're joined by Charlotte Freeman and Beej Kaczmarczyk. And as ever, we like to keep our sessions as interactive as possible, so feel free to use the question or chat facility to put any questions or thoughts to us throughout the duration of this webinar. If you're watching this on a video and you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to get in contact with Charlotte and Beej using the contact details which you will find at the end of the webinar, and they will also be on the slides which will be attached. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Beej and Charlotte. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second in the series of webinars looking at different aspects of the new assessment arrangements. And I'm joined this morning by Charlotte Freeman from NCFE. Charlotte, would you like to say a few words of introduction?
Yeah, morning, everybody. I've had the pleasure of working in endpoint assessment and apprenticeship services for the last 19 months, so hopefully I'll be able to share that experience with you today.
That's great. Thanks very much, then, Charlotte. And as I said, this is the second in the series. The first one was looking at the details of endpoint assessment. And anyone who obviously didn't get a chance to listen in on that one, we'll make sure you get copies of that to complete the two in the series. Before we start looking at the details of the gateway process and how it applies to the new standards, I think it's important sometimes just to remind us of the difference between what we perhaps have been very familiar with over the last 10, 12 years with the SACE frameworks and that method of assessment, and now looking at the introduction of standards and the differences there. In particular, we've looked at independent endpoint assessment, but today we're going to be looking at the gateway process and how we as providers and as awarding organisations can support the employers through that process. So without much more ado, over to you, Charlotte.
Wonderful, thanks, Beej. Ultimately, you're on the call today, so I'm making the assumption that you're all familiar with the new standards and the changes of endpoint assessment. One of those major gateways is the gateway audit process, ultimately, which happens after you've assessed whether the apprentice is ready to progress to be assessed for endpoint assessment. That ultimately will be a triangulated or a three-way discussion between you, the employer, who will be involved in that sign-off and readiness decision. The apprentice themselves will be involved in that, and your training provider. So your training provider effectively could be your own organisation, because you could have been set up as an employer provider on roll tapping your own right as an employer and using your levy or funding within that remit, or you may have chosen and appointed an external training provider, whether that being an independent training provider or an FE college. So that's the third party that's involved in that decision or assessment of the apprentice readiness to progress through to EPA assessment. So ultimately, I wanted to just say, what is Gateway? So Gateway, from an endpoint assessment organisation's point of view, so from our point of view, Gateway is our audit check. It is the check that the apprentice has done everything they should have done on the on-programme elements, whether that's the minimum duration of 12 months, 18 months or 24 months, whatever specified for that particular standard. And if the apprentice has achieved all of the requirements before they are pretty much signed off and we agree to assess them for endpoint assessment, because that's what needs to be done and achieved.
Charlotte, just before you move on, there's a question already. Where in the assessment, I'm just reading the question, where in the assessment plan for any particular standard would the provider see details of what is actually the gateway for each assessment method in the endpoint assessment? So I don't know if that's the question.
Yeah. All right then, Beej. It's different from each standard as to where it is. So it isn't a standard. The standards aren't wrote in any particular set format. From when I've read, I think I've read over about 25 of them, and they're dependent on the Trailblazer group. The format of how that assessment plan is pulled together ultimately does vary. But within that assessment plan, they do have to say everything that needs to be achieved from an on-programme point of view. So if I take customer service practitioner as an example, because it tends to be generic and goes over most employers, in customer service, in that assessment plan, it details that the learner needs to have achieved level 1 maths and level 1 English, that the learner, whilst on their 12-month programme, they need to have attempted level 2 maths and level 2 English. It also says that the learner should be building a portfolio of evidence to be able to showcase their skills, knowledge and competence against the required skills, knowledge and competence of the particular standard for customer service practitioner. And the assessment plan even goes into detail to recommend that they should build that in the last 3 months of that 12-month journey. So ultimately that portfolio of evidence should start being built from about 9 to 12 months. And so it details quite heavily what needs to be achieved on the on-programme training before the learner can be physically endpoint assessed by an independent endpoint assessment organisation.
And there's an additional point. Does that also include mandatory qualifications?
It does, Beej, yeah. So if there are any mandatory qualifications, it will be detailed in that assessment plan to the point of what qualification must be achieved. For if I was to take the care sector within the adult care, they have to have, within the level 2 adult care, they have to have achieved the care certificate as a mandatory component before Gateway, plus the diploma. In health as an adult care for England as well, so that diploma. So if there's mandatory qualifications, they will also be included on that checklist.
That's great. Thanks very much, Tim. Thanks.
So what I really just wanted to do is to start with, before saying how you can prepare an apprentice for Gateway, is really understanding what Gateway is. So Gateway is that ultimate checklist, or as I've put on that slide, the Gateway audit of making sure that all the on-programme requirements for that specific standard have been achieved, and you can evidence that they've been achieved before the learner is physically assessed by any endpoint assessment organisation, by that independent EPAO, effectively.
And there's another question before you move on. We've got lots of questions coming through. A question here is, if you've completed work in the Gateway, can that be used in the endpoint assessment process? In other words, you know, the same bit of evidence, or as you said, you might use it, say, in a presentation.
Yeah, so ultimately the Gateway audit is where you would upload the evidence that's required to be assessed. So for instance, in that customer service practitioner, there is 3 components for that particular standard. There is an apprentice showcase, which basically is a submittal of a portfolio of evidence which will be marked by the IEPA, the independent endpoint assessor will mark that, and then have a discussional interview with the apprentice to elaborate on the evidence they've provided and to confirm skills, knowledge and competence. Yeah. The second component is an observation, which is obviously then conducted by the independent endpoint assessor. And the final component is a professional discussion. But at Gateway, you are submitting the portfolio evidence, which effectively will be marked by the IEPA.
That's good. And we've got a question from Leslie. How do we evidence the care certificate?
So the care certificate, we are drawing up, and I can only speak from ourselves as NCFE Cash, under our Cash brand, all of the health, adult care and childcare standards will be marketed. We have drawn up a list of what is eligible evidence that you can submit at Gateway to justify that care certificate. But essentially, it's not a qualification, as I'm sure you're all familiar. It is an inductory programme that needs to be completed within a certain timescale, and it's obviously controlled by the Skills for Health or Care. I always get the 2 mixed up. But essentially, an in-house certificate showing that you've signed off all the auditory trail of that particular care certificate will be enough evidence to submit. Because at the same time at Gateway, what you also have to upload is your diploma evidence, and the diploma almost out-trumps the care certificate, because when you complete the full diploma over the 12-month duration, it's mapped to the care certificate, a lot of the units within that diploma anyway. So you are trumping, by the time you get to Gateway, the diploma supersedes the evidence of the care certificate.
And Claire asked the question, if there's a delay in receiving the certificate from the awarding organisation, will the endpoint assessment organisation accept a result slip?
Yeah, as long as it's formatted results and we can clearly see. I can only speak from NCFE cash awarding services. So what we have done is we've already got an ACE approved digital result slip that you used to be able to submit onto your ACE claim, and so you have that instantly the second you claim for a certificate for a learner, and that would be an instant piece of evidence that you would then be able to upload at Gateway, so you don't have to wait for the physical certificate. I don't know how other awarding organisations operate, but if they have something similar in terms of digital evidence that you can then attach as supporting evidence of achievement, then yes.
And I think Paul's just added to that for the level 2 adult care worker, the exact details of what must be achieved and completed before advancing through the gateway is on the bottom of page 3 of the assessment plan. So bottom of page 3 of the assessment plan. Thanks very much, Paul, for that bit of information.
Yeah, wonderful. Sorry, I couldn't tell you exact pages of every standard. It does vary from standard to standard. So wonderful, Paul. Thank you for that. Shall we move on to the next slide? Because really this was just to confirm everyone's understanding of Gateway. So essentially, the core point really of being able to prepare your apprentice for Gateway is understanding what they need to do before Gateway and having a clear understanding of what should be covered on that on-programme assessment. And your assessment plan for that standard will give you that particular evidence. So your assessment plan will tell you the full understandings of the standard skills, knowledge and behaviours. So ultimately, it's that go-to point of reference to say this is what you should be building on programme and what you should be delivering before you reach Gateway, and ultimately what the learner should be achieving or being able to clearly demonstrate their competence in before they get to Gateway. I would also advise every employer that's on here that you have a really good, strong, supportive mentor system for your apprentice when they're in place in the workplace, that you're providing the support from your side of things, because if they're building a portfolio, it may be required that your apprentice's work mentor supports witness statements of evidence to compile in their portfolio. In some particular standards, you're actually involved in the independent assessment. Either you form part of the panel for a panel interview. So it's really making sure that you fully understand what role you're going to play in that apprentice's journey. And again, the assessment plan is one of the main points of call where you can get that information from. Or effectively, if you're working with your training provider can help and coach you to fully understand the expectations of what you need to do to support that apprentice through their journey. I'm sure all of you have heard an awful lot about 20% off the job training. And again, I kind of put this on here, but as one of your commitments as an employer when you are engaging apprentices and taking apprentices on as part of your workforce is that they do require to have 20% of their working hours off the job where they can effectively develop and learn the underpinning knowledge to support their skills, knowledge and behaviour within that given sector. And again, your training provider, if you're working with a training provider or you're an employer provider in your own right, there are lots of different types of learning that can be justified as the 20% off the job. So you can do lots of different models and flexibly build in blended learning and distance learning, as long as the apprentice is physically not doing their day job and they're acquiring the skills that are developing their skills, knowledge and behaviours for the particular standard, then they can be classified as the off the job. But my kind of point of reference to you is there is a full guidance on the 20% off the job. There's a policy of what can be accepted as off the job and what can't be accepted as off the job training. And again, it's familiarising yourself with that so that you can be fully committed in supporting your apprentice on their journey, achieving and building on their skills, knowledge and competence in the correct way when you're using the public money, because that is one of the funding requirements. And again, it's by knowing what the apprentice needs to achieve from an on-programme and fully understanding what they should be doing over a 12 or an 18 or 24-month programme, you can effectively be more involved in the tracking of them to making sure that they are making continuous progress against what they should be doing. And this will give you a much better position when you come to that triangulated three-way discussion at the end of the apprentice's journey to be able to effectively make an evaluation or a judgment as if is your apprentice or employee ready to progress through endpoint assessment. By having a full understanding, that's the only way you're going to be able to make that judgment call. Because if you don't fully understand what the apprentice should be doing over that 12 or 18 or 24 months, then how can you be involved in that three-way discussion at the end to fully assess whether you think your apprentice should now be evaluated by an independent source to see whether they are competent or not? So my call to action to all of you wonderful employers that are on the webinar today is know what your commitments are when you are taking on an apprentice or signing your existing employees up to an apprenticeship funded scheme.
And just in addition to that, Charlotte, a couple of comments which are supportive. One is, where is the policy with respect to 20% off the job training? I think my best thing is go to the recent ESFA guidance on 20% off the job, and they have got all the sort of examples of what they see as good practice, as well as the Institute for Apprenticeships. So you'll find that there's plenty of examples there. I think one of the things, the key thing is that the training, if the training happens in the employer's premises, that's okay. It doesn't always have to be off-site, as long as it's obviously during what would be normally considered to be the working hours of that apprentice. If the apprentice is doing anything in what I call out of job time, say in an evening or whatever, that is counted as off the job as long as there is time off in lieu. And I think that's another thing to record. And obviously, whether you record it through an e-portfolio or some kind of journal, I think it's important it's always recorded. One other thing, just to add to what you've said, Charlotte, there, I think it's important that also the employer understands their role in celebrating the sort of achievements of their apprentices as they progress towards the endpoint assessment. I think that aspect has also got to be taken account of.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the only thing that's going to build confidence along their journey as well. I think for some apprentices, it's going to be a really scary new world where they're going to meet this person that they've never met before in their life, who ultimately is making a judgment call on whether they're competent or not. Not only that, are they making a judgment call on whether they pass or they fail, they're then going to grade them as to whether they're an exceptional apprentice or they're just an okay, average, good pass apprentice. So for me, that's an awful lot of pressure. And I think on the last webinar, Beej, that you and I did, I used the example of learning to drive, or one of our delegates added that to us. And how much pressure, if we all reflect back to when we learned to drive, you learned to drive with somebody you built the trust with and in a relationship over time. And then on the day of your test, you sat with this complete stranger who was making judgment calls of whether you were capable or not, and didn't have any previous knowledge of how well you've performed over the last 12 months, but was making a judgment call on that specific day. That's what all of our apprentices are going to face now. So if they're not having constant backup or reassurance that they have got the skills, knowledge and behaviours, and celebrating the success that they've got those skills, knowledge and behaviours, then that's quite a hard thing to face if you've got no confidence build up until that point. So I think morally that's what we have to do as employers that are supporting apprentices and training providers throughout the journey, is constantly acknowledge their successes and reassure them on their successes.
And that raises a couple of other questions. It's good to see that we always get plenty of questions. And the first one I want you to look at is how, in terms of, therefore, if you've got the employer involved actively in the timeline towards the endpoint assessment and the provider, surely the question is, surely the endpoint assessment organisation has got to be involved in that timeline. Otherwise, you're going to have big, high numbers coming forward for endpoint assessment in some parts in some time, and other times very few people coming through.
You've got to remember that we are independent, so we're not going to be involved in the learning or the coaching or the development, but we definitely will want to be talking to employers and training providers to understand your learner numbers and learner volumes. And those conversations are happening with all of the centres we're engaging with already. And yes, we are asking for 12-month to 18-month profiles of how you sign up and enroll over a 12-month period, so that we can understand what your trends are, and then nationally we can then compile that data to understand where our peaks and our troughs are in terms of meeting our SLAs, because we have quite significant service level agreements that we've been selling and obviously shouting about from the mountains. We obviously want to achieve them. Well, the only way that we can achieve them is by being prepared. The only way that we can be prepared is by understanding demand, which means we need to understand the learner profiles that are coming from employers and being signed up. Secondly, we also have a moral obligation. I firmly believe that although we are independent, we can't tell you what we're going to assess or how we're going to assess, but we can guide you about how we're going to allocate marks. We can guide you on the types of scenarios or the wording or the questions that we might structure within our assessment, because we've been told that we can do that. We can give you mock assessments if there is end test. I'm kind of stealing my thunder for later on in the presentation. But effectively, yes, we do have a commitment in that timeline and that journey, whilst also maintaining that independence.
Yep, thank you for that. Thank you.
So it's really important to understand your commitments for the on-programme, but also understanding the assessment plan for me is really key. So if you're going to prepare your learner for your apprentice, you need to know what they're doing. And that's where I come back to the fact that, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anyone that's religious, but I kind of refer to the assessment plan as my own little Bible. That's my go-to document, basically, to know what I'm talking about. It's ultimately your go-to document to know what you should be doing with your apprentice before they come to Gateway, and ultimately what happens with your apprentice after Gateway, because within that particular plan, it tells you what endpoint assessment is all about. It tells you what components should be assessed for that particular standard. It tells you how they will be assessed, how they will be graded, how they will be weighted in terms of the different components. They tell us as endpoint assessment organisations the sequential order that those particular components may have to take place in. They also say whether they can be retake or resat or not. So in certain standards, they will cap the number of retakes, or they will say that actually you can't retake this particular component. We don't make those rules up. The Trailblazer Group, those ultimately that their minimum number of 10 employees that come together at the very start of the journey and submit the standard to the IFA, the Institute for Apprentice, for the board to say whether it gets accepted or not. They make the rule book up. As an endpoint assessment organisation, as a training provider or an employer training provider delivering your programmes, or as an employer knowing and understanding what your apprentice has to do, it was all set by that Trailblazer Group at the very beginning. They set out the stall at the start of what needs to be done for that apprentice, the roles and the responsibilities to ensure an independence, who will externally quality assure us as an endpoint assessment organisation, and ultimately the whole scheme of internal quality as well that we need to follow as an endpoint assessment organisation to make sure that there is national standardisation of how endpoint assessment is conducted for that standard. And also ultimately to make sure that regardless of which endpoint assessment organisation you pick, you still need to go through the same gateway checks. So it should be no different from EPA or organisation A, B or C. Your gateway sign-off check should still be the same because they all derive from the same set of rules.
And I think there's an additional point here, Charlotte, that one person's making. In effect, the endpoint assessment process starts with a gateway. It's the front end of the gateway. But one of the things that they commented on, besides the mandatory aspects of the occupational standard, it also should specify clearly the work that you need to do before you get to the endpoint assessment that underpins whatever the assessment method is that's used in the endpoint assessment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and ultimately that's what, when you understand the assessment plan and you read the assessment plans, and I have to say some assessment plans are better at helping you than others. And there are some that are better worded and wrote than others. that's what that assessment plan ultimately does. If I bring it back as a comparison to the old world, where you had the qualifications framework and a SAFE framework, and you then had a qualification specification that said you had this unit to complete and these are your subunits that you need to complete. The assessment plan is the only place really that it has that finite level of detail of saying, actually, this assessment, so the observation component will assess these areas, these skills, knowledge and behaviours will be assessed by this particular component. And this other component will look at A, B and C in terms of the other skills, knowledge and behaviours. So that's why I think it's really important to read and understand that assessment plan if you are making that commitment to a particular standard.
Yeah, and two things come from that, Charlotte. One, we use the language as providers, and the same as an awarding organisation, the language of assessment and curriculum. A key point that's been made by someone here is that we must make sure we use the language of the employer so that they understand all this detail, because they won't always have access to the terminology.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Well made, actually. And I think that's something that we probably need to go back and just censor check ourselves, that all of our documentation that we've done is easily and interpretable. What we have done is, within all our documentation that we've provided as an endpoint assessment to help or to support the employer, is we've always done a glossary of terms. So within the glossary of terms, we've defined what we mean by provider, and we've defined what we mean by employer, so that even if you don't know the language, there's at least a point of reference that you go to try and define what we're talking about when we use a particular term.
And the second point, which is raised by one of our listeners, you mentioned existing staff as well as new staff. How can this be evidence for significant learning as stated in the funding rules? I think, the key thing that I would say before you come in on this, Charlotte, is that existing staff will undertake apprenticeships where there's significantly different role or there's significantly different sets of skills, and that obviously is evidenced in the assessment plan when you say, look at these are the skills and this is the knowledge and these are the behaviours that this person will be undertaking. Clearly, if there isn't a large amount of new learning, it does have an impact, obviously, on the funding that's attached to that particular apprentice as well. And I think that's much more of a management information issue about not claiming the full funding. Would you want to add anything to that, Charlotte?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Beej. You will have existing staff that step up into new roles or step in and might diversify their positions. So they may potentially come into into your organisation as a business administrator and then decide that they are really good, strong communicators with customers and might move to your customer service team. Well, they're acquiring a new skill set, so therefore they may be the perfect candidate to go on to a customer service practitioner qualification. Or likewise, we're working in the wonderful world, because we do in NCFE an awful lot. We work and put project teams together. So it might be that somebody's just involved in a new project. So the project manager at level 4 would be a great apprenticeship scheme for an existing member of staff to go on to really consolidate their understanding of project management and project working. It's very difficult, I think, for existing staff for the level 5 operational manager and department manager, because you're newly appointed managers. Naturally, that sees a nice fit that would to support their step up to a new management role that they go in a level 5. But it is all about that acquiring that new skill set. So as long as you can justify that it is a new skill set that they're undertaking, then very much they can be funded to do an apprenticeship, whether existing or newly appointed staff. I think it's just making that initial assessment, as Beej just said.
Yeah, thank you for that. Then, and Carol, Charlotte, I've just added this understanding the endpoint assessment plan. I think it's just emphasising all the things that you've just said, and I think that's critical, because any requirements or outputs that underpin the assessment method, such as a portfolio, which demonstrate specific aspects of an occupational standard, that could be used later on in the endpoint assessment to support, for example, an endpoint to support a presentation or a showcase. So I think it's clear that those requirements are a part of the assessment plan, as you said.
Yeah, definitely. And I think understanding it will also understand when you come in, because from an appointer's point of view, in lots of the funding, it says that this negotiation, but I think if you need to negotiate or you're going to get into that, you need to fully understand actually what needs to be delivered and actually what needs to be covered. And there's an awful lot more that needs to be delivered in order to be able to get an apprentice at the end of a 12-month journey to be competent enough to pass independent assessments now. So yeah, you need to fully understand it. Otherwise, I love the saying that I always try and justify to my husband, but buy cheap, buy twice. If you don't fully understand that assessment plan, but you're quite heavily negotiating on price, then you might not necessarily get that quality delivery that covers all of them components that needs to be done to fully skill your apprentice for that final judgment call and that final assessment by an independent endpoint assessor.
One other question just before we move on. Can the plan include any content that's not included in the occupational standard? I would think, say, for example, an additional qualification, which is not mandatory. The answer is no. I thought no, but would you like to confirm that?
For me, I think this is this whole choice of the employer, Beej. It won't be funded. So it's not mandatory. It's not fundable. If it's a recommended qualification, then really this is the choice of you sitting down as an employer and deciding what do you want as an outcome for your staff. If you want them to achieve a qualification alongside doing their learning, and it figures and it makes sense that they're acquiring skills, knowledge and competence, then that's your decision as an employer to put in that qualification. But essentially there will be additional costs of having an additional qualification in there. If it's not mandatory, then it's not funded by either your levy pot of money or the non-levy pot, if that's how you're attracting the funding for that apprenticeship. So yes, essentially, if you want extra qualifications, then that's a discussion to have, and that's your choice, but there may be additional costs as a result of that.
And
you don't need to do it the gateway.
Sorry, that additional qualification would not be part of the gateway process.
So if it's not mandatory, then it won't be asked for you to justify it in an audit gateway process. No. The gateway process is about ticking off what you must do, not the extra nice bits that you might want to add on, that are just literally are your decisions as an employer to add on extras, but the extras are never going to be assessed at gateway.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Thank you. So what types of assessment might we see?
So different types of assessments would be, we've mentioned in the customer service, the portfolio assessment, lots of different names around a portfolio assessment like showcase. The showcase just means that there's an additional interview as part of that particular assessment. Interviews, which can be one-on-one interviews. They might be panel interviews where the employer is actually involved, so you form part of the panel. They tend to be more of the higher level apprentices. So if I think of the standards we're doing, your level 5 ops manager and departmental manager has a panel interviewing where you as the employer are on that panel as part of that. Professional discussions. There's a sequential order that I've mentioned where in the assessment plan, they will say you need to do components A and B before you do component C. The final component that tends to be the most final is the professional discussion. In the majority of the standards we're doing, the 18 that we're on the register for, the professional discussion is always the final component for those particular 18. It's the last chance saloon almost for the apprentice to be able to justify their skills, knowledge and behaviours and demonstrate that they are competent and the assessor will have a discussion with them to draw out any evidence, maybe that they're a borderline grade or a borderline between a pass and a fail, and that's what that discussion is all about. Observations, which you will be familiar with because observations occurred very frequently on the on-programme journey within the SACE frameworks through continuous assessment, but observations is something that can be picked. You tend to find, or again, I'm just thinking of the trend of the standards that endpoint assessment that NCFE and CASH are doing, that the observations are in place when there isn't a mandatory qualification. When the Trailblazer Group have put a mandatory qualification in, you don't tend to see an observation in there. And again, that's because when there's a mandatory qualification in there, continuous assessment's taking place, and generally observations forms part of that continuous assessment. So they've removed that out of the endpoint assessment components because they've been continually assessed through their learning journey with a mandatory qual. We are seeing lots of multiple choice questions, which is the MCQ question tests at the end, or short answers, which means that they need to elaborate on various different questions. There are projects that are being used where it's either a topic that's been set by the independent assessment organisation, or in some instances it's where you, the employer, will set the topic with your apprentice, and it just needs to be approved by us as the endpoint assessment organisation. And again, in that assessment plan, it gives you criteria of what the project would be looking to cover, but you might come up with a specific employer-led project that's valuable to you as well whilst they're doing it, that they need to submit. Culinary challenge, I have to say, is my personal favourite because it reminds me of Ready, Steady, Cook, basically. It's in the hospitality standards where the apprentice basically gets a bag of food given by the endpoint assessment organisation, and then they have to go and do a dish. So it's very much the red pepper and the green pepper, if anybody used to watch it. So I do laugh and joke and say we need the NCFE Ready, Steady, Cook bag for that particular challenge. CPD logs naturally in discussions tend to be the higher level or the higher grade apprentices that we deal with, but you have to log an evidence of your CPD within that particular sector and have discussions with your IEPA around your CPD. And presentations where you get set a topic to then be able to actually present back to your IEPA on a particular subject. But they tend to be the themes of what's done. In the IFA, the Institute for Apprenticeship Guidance for Trailblazers, it specifies that you need to have a minimum of 2 components in your assessment plan. So that when they're developing that standard, they need to pick from a range of assessment methods that best give the best evaluation tool to be able to assess the skills, knowledge and competence for that particular sector, but they need to pick a minimum of 2 combinations. Some do go up to 5.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what's the maximum, Charlotte?
Actually, when I was reading the IFA guidance the other day, there wasn't a maximum, there was just a minimum of 2. Yeah, but I have seen some of the assessment plans. I think the most that I've seen in there is 5 at the moment.
And just another question, there's two questions. It's about the additional non-funded qualification. You know, we're saying if it's not mandatory, would that be counted towards 20% off the job? My interpretation, Charlotte, has been that English and maths and any additional qualifications are not actually counted towards the 20%. It's the 20% that in relation to what is required for either the framework or the standard.
Yeah, I would say there's always a grey, isn't there? And it's all about interpretation. If you read the funding guidance, it says your 20% off the job should be where you're acquiring skills, knowledge and competence for the particular standard. So you're obviously doing the competence of the standard. If you can justify that bolt-on, that additional qualification that you're using can be mapped to some of those skills, knowledge and competence, so therefore the work you're doing is acquiring skills, knowledge and competence of the standard, then that particular time, I would imagine, could be equated to your 20%. But if you're doing some aspects on that qualification that cannot be mapped to the skills, knowledge and competence of the standard because it's extra stuff, then that wouldn't be counted. Yeah.
And similarly, the English and maths is addition to the 20% as well. And there's a further question about the portfolio. When it talks about, you know, you have to, it clarifies, the assessment plan will clarify that before you can complete and go through the gateway, you must have completed the portfolio. Do they stipulate what should be in the portfolio?
They give topic areas. So if I take the customer service practitioner in that assessment plan, it gives topic areas. I think there's 10 different topic areas that should be justified and demonstrated in the portfolio. As an endpoint assessment, that's where we've interpreted those 10 areas in a little bit more detail. And within our guidance to employers and training providers, we've elaborated on those maybe then 10 themes for customer service to say that this is what you need to justify under theme 1, and this is the type of you might need to justify it. So we've elaborated it more on the assessment plan. The assessment plan itself does detail for the customer service, and I'm sure it does for all the others. It will detail the core significant points that need to be demonstrated by that piece of evidence.
That's great, thank you. So in terms of assessing the readiness of an apprentice for the gateway, what key things should we note here?
Yeah, so I've put some questions on that slide. So I think you need to be asking yourself, has the apprentice completed everything that's required? So have they done everything that they needed to do on programme? Because essentially, whether you're using your levy money for this apprentice or whether you're drawing down from a provider non-levy money, it is public money, and therefore it's an auditable public money trail. And therefore you need to be able to evidence that an audit that you have done everything that you should have done with that public money. So it's very much, has the apprentice completed everything that they're required? And that's just basically, from a point of view, from an audit trail point of view, you need to be doing that. But also, for morally, if the apprentice hasn't done everything they should be doing, you're setting them up for a massive fail, because they will just fail the gateway submission. If you've not got the validated evidence, there will be an instant fail, and you've just wasted your money of endpoint assessment. Can your apprentice completely display all the required skills, knowledge and competence? Do you think if you were to assess them independently that they would be able to pass the endpoint assessment requirements? Could they confidently talk about how competent they are in all the different areas for that particular standard? If it's a yes, then yes, they're probably ready for gateway. This is why you, the employer, and the apprentice, and whoever is your conduit for training, whether it's your own team or an external team, are involved in making these decisions. Are they competent to be able to demonstrate that to somebody else? Are they prepared and skilled to face the assessment components? And that's why I think it's really important to select the right endpoint assessment organisation. Have you give them preparation and mock assessments on those components? Do you think that when they're faced for a professional discussion or a showcase or an observation, that you've done it already with them before, so they kind of know what to expect in the best scenario? Yes, it's completely independent, because it's not you that's going to make that judgment call at the end. But have you give them a taste before they actually go through it in terms of mock assessments? Because I think that's really, really important, that you're not setting them up to fail because they've never actually experienced what a panel interview is about before in their life. So it's a completely new experience the first time they go through it. I also think you also need to be thinking from an employee's perspective is, I'm aware of all the different components, so when can I physically support them happening? What time can I allow it to occur? And have a little bit of a diary look. When could they be released to be able to do the different components that they need to do? When would be the best time for them to be observed, because they'll be able to showcase all of the different requirements that they need to showcase when they're being observed by an IEPA. So really, it's about considering when and at what date and at what time and at what location is it best for these things to happen. Can or should you be involved? And again, this is where I come back to the assessment planning is, can you be involved? Because there are some instances where you can be involved in the discussions, the professional discussions. So should you also make yourself available to help or guide your apprentice in the best way? Or are you just not allowed in there because it's completely sealed and it's completely independent? But understanding that knows how you can influence those decisions when they're being made. I think you also need to know the impacts, because it's a commitment when you're signing them up for endpoint assessment, and obviously it's then a commitment that the endpoint assessment organisation is making and then allocating a member of staff. But also, if that's cancelled, what is the impact of missing that particular scheduled date? And having an understanding of that, which is why ultimately in the whole funding guidance, and it's the employer that's making that decision on the endpoint assessment. And yes, in this new world, it is so new, you will no doubt go to your training provider relationships and they will be the best people because they've got the experience and the knowledge to advise you on it. But ultimately, you need to have that understanding of what impact that is, because there's only a certain amount of fundable money. So how does that impact you if your learner needs to take a resit? Is that an additional cost or not? If you have to cancel as an employer an observation that was taking place at Thursday at 2 o'clock, how does that impact you financially if you need to then reschedule and rebook? These are all considerations about getting ready for Gateway and all the things that you would need to consider before you physically commit to it and spend that initial money and book in those first assessment dates.
I think there's a couple of points I would certainly add to what you've just said before we move, into sort of conclusion. This is really about a partnership, and as you said, it's a three-way partnership, but actually it's a four-way partnership, because you've got to obviously, as you said, provide some sort of sense of what the demand's going to be for endpoint assessment organisations. But I think what's is critical is that we as providers will have to ensure that the employer understands the minimum English and maths requirements, what mandatory qualifications might be required in the standard, and any other requirements or outputs that underpin whatever assessment method is going to be used. But ultimately, it's the employer that confirms that they are confident that the apprentice is occupationally competent, and that's either working at the level of the standard or in excess of the standard, because that can also happen if they're working above the level. So they're ready, therefore, to to commit to the endpoint assessment. So I think it's that partnership that's critical here, Charlotte.
Oh yeah, definitely. And that and again, I will go on to in the next slide, sort of as a summative of what we're doing as an endpoint assessment organisation. But that's where we're doing we're like the fourth cog really within that wheel of what our commitment is to help and support you as an endpoint assessment organisation. If you were to select us, thanks for the slide there, Malik. But the gateway support packs essentially is our commitment in that relationship and that partnership. We're saying that we've done this for all of our standards. Some is not ready for certain standards, but most of this is now ready for the 18 standards that we are delivering. But we're saying that in order to support that journey, in order to support those mock assessments, in order to help with the understanding, in order to make those evaluations and judgments at Gateway, you need a checklist and you need to know what you're doing at the front end. We've done that bit for you to try and make it a little bit easier, and we've kind of interpreted that assessment plan and made some really user-friendly resources to help with that journey as you go along. So to help know and fully understand what needs to be done on the program aspect, so that when you come to interact with us at the Gateway audit, you can easily audit what's been done, and then you can access and book in the assessments, and you can also prepare your apprentice for those assessments and how they will be conducted.
And I think that's a critical thing, Charlotte, is that whichever endpoint assessment organisation you choose, really you want to make sure that in that service level agreement you have these essential parts, these essential aspects of support.
Yeah, I think this is really, really new. So when we approached it, because it's also new to us, as we were 170 years experience in awarding, but endpoint assessment is still new to us. Summative assessment isn't, because it's been built into various different qualifications over the years, and quality assurance and standardisation isn't. So we're applying a lot of what we know to the new world, because there's lots of synergies there. But we ultimately took it from our customer's point of view. How can we help you? How can we help you, the employer? Can we help and prepare the apprentice? And how can we support our training providers that we work with? And this is kind of what we've come up with. So it's still work in process. If we've missed something or we've not covered all bases, we'd love to hear from you. But we think that we've got a really comprehensive offer to support you. And I think that's your decision now, is when you go into endpoint assessments organisation, is asking what they have to support you throughout that journey.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. And there's a couple of issues here that just been raised, which I think are very specific to one occupation. It's the nuances of endpoint assessment and Gateway. Are you aware that in some the 36-month to 48 standards, that's the quite long in terms of the apprenticeship program, that some of the Gateway processes, including achievement of qualifications after 1 year. So in other words, there's almost like a staggered Gateway process, which means if you don't achieve that level by the end of the 12 months, you're actually not able to progress.
I believe they aren't the sectors we are particularly looking at under our NCFE and cash brands, but I'm looking to my other colleague that's in the room, Mark, and I'm very grateful that he's with me at this moment in time. His past experience, as he's just mentioned, that yes, I think in the engineering sector,
that's right. Yes, yeah.
There are gradual achievements that they need to do so that they're almost collating their gateway experience over their period of and duration on programme. We're quite fortunate, I'd like to say, quite smugly over here that NCFE and cash, we don't have that as a scenario. We have a couple where the projects need to be done 3 months in advance of the gateway. But like I say, that's a sequential order, and we are managing that through our platform and through our service.
Yeah. I think that's critical is that, as you said right at the very beginning, the gateway and the endpoint assessment very different for each set of standards, isn't it?
Yes. I'd love to say that word standard makes us all think that it's all going to be standard, but there's no standard approach to standards, really. That's what's ironic about it.
That's the diversity that we love in the apprenticeship world. So just a couple of things then. I just thought that just to sum up, this is from my viewpoint as an employer provider, and certainly Charlotte and the team have already sort of gone over some of this, but I think it's important that whatever happens, if you're a provider, an awarding organisation, you provide the employer with easy to understand guide to the standard, the assessment plan, the gateway process and endpoint assessment, similar to what Charlotte's just shared with us. But I think there's also this real need to actively engage with the employer on the on-programme. That continuous relationship that you have, because after all, the employer is the person that arbitrates on the gateway and determines whether that apprentice is competent or not. So I think the more you engage, as Charlotte said, with the on-programme elements in understanding the assessment plan, the better. But also to make sure that where there are mandatory qualifications, to make sure that you can work with the employer and the awarding organisation to choose the units to develop the assessment for. So those are the most appropriate. And I think there's obviously some issues still around the residue of some of the NVQ qualifications that were around prior to the standards, which might have been included in the interim in the Trailblazers. But I think that is, again, useful there. But I think the most important thing is that you might say we want this apprentice to complete in 12, 13 months, but of course, ultimately, the employer might say, well, I don't think they're ready yet, or they haven't been active or learning long enough to demonstrate the competencies. So I think there's some key issues there about making sure the employer is also party to the original decisions about the duration of the apprenticeship and not just standardise that. As Charlotte said, I think it's important that you agree with the employer what the courses of action are if the apprentice isn't ready yet for endpoint assessment. You don't want to commit them to failure, or, as Charlotte says, if the apprentice fails, and then you've got obviously resit or retakes and implications of that. I think I always like to sort of have that quote from the IFA: consider how you will provide the employer with a consistent approach and service. In some cases, you'll be offering a service to an employer of several apprentices on very different standards. So that point, Charlotte, they might be doing, you might be talking to an employer that actually has got the engineering apprentices that we talked about, as well as your customer service and business admin. So I think the main thing is to make sure that whatever your employer partner, whoever they are, is that you're able to provide as a provider and as an awarding organisation the right amount of support for those different standards and those different apprentices. Any other points you want to make, Charlotte, just in conclusion? But we've had a lot of good questions. I don't know if there's any other questions that are being posed, Marek. Charlotte, do you want to make some concluding remarks?
I think I've kind of said it all the way through. The only real way to be prepared for Gateway is to understand what lies before it and understand what lies after it, so you can make that full evaluation as to whether the apprentice is ready to go through Gateway. Because Gateway is that progressional decision from I've completed everything I need to do at that front end, and I'm now ready to tackle the final element of my apprenticeship. And so in order to make that judgment call, you need to fully understand what is involved in both aspects. So that's the only major thing that I can do. And just to go back to that 20% off the job, the actual funding policy was published by the Department for Education back in June 2017. It's called Apprenticeship Off-the-Job Training Policy Background and Examples. So if people do want to kind of Google it or try and find it on the web, just to make it a little bit easier for you to find the policy.
And I think the key point, Charlotte, is since that policy document, there have been several additional sort of interpretations. I think one of the things that I would certainly suggest is that, and, you know, I'm not talking about red herrings here, but I certainly found from my experience of working with employers, we haven't had a lot of problems with the 20% once we've sort of brainstormed the different approaches to it. As you said, you know, doing project work, it's not lost production or lost service. If actually the learner, the apprentice is learning something new and then applying it in the workplace, the 20% off the job could actually contribute to an improvement in productivity, sales, or service. So, you know, I think it's about being a bit more creative. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's not new. I think everybody seems to have jumped on this 20% rule, that it's this new rule. It's not new. It's always been in the funding rules for the 14 years that I've been involved in apprenticeships. It's just that they're going to audit. You just need to evidence how you are delivering against it a lot more now.
Yeah. And as we said, using, you know, one file, e-portfolio, smart assessor, or some kind of journal, even if it's a paper-based journal, encourage the apprentice to always record that 10, that 15 minutes when they might be shadowing someone, being actively involved in a learning situation, a workshop, or for example, just sitting in the hall, learning how to use a new piece of equipment, you know, what we call vestibule training. Is all, you can count that towards the 20%.
Yeah, completely agreed, because I think there was an example, I think it was an engineering example when I was last there, Beej, that they were saying that even teaching them to use a particular part of equipment, but the fact is they're taken maybe out of the major production line and they're taken to a side to show them how to use that equipment. That is skills, knowledge and competence for that particular job role. That's on the job training. But it's off the job because they're not physically lively contributing to the product line or the outputs at that time, but they're on the shop floor and they're in the workplace. They're just learning what they need to do.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And there's further information, obviously, on the remainder of our slides about the things that NCFE provides. You can read those for yourself, as well as obviously cash. And obviously, we're still waiting for some of those standards to be approved.
Yeah.
And if you, sorry.
They're the ones at the bottom.
Yeah, that's right. The ones at the bottom.
We're all waiting for early years with bated breath, imminently in April, apparently.
I think we're also waiting for the new standards for workplace mentors. You know, that would really help our assessor tutors to acquire some new skills and get some, you know, a bit of a career progression. So we're waiting for those as well. There you are. There's the people that can help you from the apprenticeship services at NCFE. So obviously you've got the contact details for Charlotte and her colleagues, and also our details if you want to get back to us about any aspects of the webinars that we're offering. We've had a series recently, Charlotte, you're aware, on looking at different aspects of teaching and learning in apprenticeships. And we're going to continue those after Easter with some new ones on things like target setting, feedback, review meetings, etc. The on-program support that you said was so critical to making sure that our apprentices are ready through the gateway for endpoint assessment. So thanks very much for all the questions. Charlotte, thank you again. I'm glad that you haven't struggled through the snow today to be able to present.
Oh my. We've actually seen the sun in the sky in the northeast, which is phenomenal in itself. So yes, thank you very much for having me.
Don't get too excited. There'll be snow on Saturday and Sunday, I hear, in some parts of the country.
Oh, please, no more.
Any more questions, Marek? We've had some really good questions. Hopefully we've been able to, well, I've certainly had a look at all the questions and I've put them and posed them. But I think it's important to just take, as I said, from Charlotte's presentation, take note and make sure that we do the very best for our apprentices and obviously for the employers that are critical to their success. So thanks very much for everyone. Thanks for the feedback. We're getting some very good feedback, Charlotte. So thanks very much for your inputs today. Any more questions, Marek?
Oh, I think that's it for the questions. I'm about to shut the recording down, so if you do have any further questions, you can perhaps grab us quickly. Alternatively, you've got the contact details there, so I'd encourage that you can get in contact with Beej, Charlotte, and the rest of the team with any questions or thoughts, and let's hope that the sun is shining on all apprenticeships and the training world. So I'm going to close the recording.